Imagine opening your mailbox in 1964 and finding a catalog selling rocket engines, not model rockets, not toys. Actual, honest-to-God rocket engines that you could bolt onto your car. No special license required, no background check. Just send a check and wait for a wooden crate containing enough thrust to turn your grocery getter into a death machine. This actually happened. For 6 absolutely insane years, a Florida engineer named Gene Middlebrooks ran a company called Turbonique that sold rocket-powered superchargers, jet fuel-burning turbines, and complete rocket axles through mail-order catalogs. The crown jewel of his product line? The Thermoline Drag Axle, a self-contained rocket propulsion system that replaced your entire rear axle and delivered 1,300 horsepower for about 5 seconds, long enough to run a quarter mile, or die trying. Picture this scene. It's a Saturday night at Lyons Drag Strip in California, 1965. A beat-up-looking Volkswagen Beetle rolls up to the starting line. The crowd chuckles. Then the driver flips a toggle switch. A sound like ripping canvas mixed with a freight train fills the air as orange flames shoot 6 feet behind the bug. The little car doesn't accelerate. It teleports. 0 to 180 miles per hour in under 9 seconds. The driver? Just some guy who ordered a rocket from a magazine. This is the story of Turbonique, the most dangerous performance company in automotive history. A company that operated in a brief window when the government hadn't yet figured out that maybe, just maybe, selling military-grade rocket motors to teenagers wasn't the best idea. A company whose products killed multiple customers, sent its founder to federal prison, and left behind a trail of melted pistons, scattered wreckage, and some of the most spectacular drag racing footage ever captured. Gene Middlebrooks wasn't trying to build a business empire. He was an aerospace engineer who got bored and decided to see what would happen if you gave hot rodders access to actual rocket technology. What happened was beautiful, terrifying, and completely predictable. To understand how a legitimate engineer ended up selling death machines through Popular Science magazine, we need to travel back to 1962. America was deep in the space race. NASA was throwing money at anything that moved fast or exploded properly. Aerospace companies were hiring every engineer who could spell thrust. And Orlando, Florida had become a hub for rocket development thanks to the nearby Cape Canaveral. Eugene Middlebrooks was one of those aerospace engineers working on legitimate rocket projects. But while his colleagues were focused on getting to the moon, Middlebrooks had a different vision. He looked at all this cutting-edge rocket technology and thought, you know what would be cool? Putting this on a streetcar. The early 1960s hot rod scene was experiencing its own technological revolution. Drag racing had exploded from an underground activity to a legitimate sport. Manufacturers were locked in a horsepower war. The 409 cubic-inch Chevy was battling Ford's 427. Mopar was developing the 426 Hemi. Aftermarket companies were making fortunes selling superchargers, headers, and camshafts. But everyone was still playing with the same basic technology, internal combustion engines burning gasoline. Middlebrooks saw an opportunity. While everyone else was trying to squeeze another 50 horsepower out of a V8, he could offer something completely different: real rocket power. In 1962, he founded Turbonique Incorporated in Orlando. The name suggested sophisticated turbine technology. The reality was much more terrifying. Middlebrooks wasn't interested in gradual improvements or safety margins. His business model was simple. Take military rocket technology, simplify it just enough that a shade tree mechanic could install it and sell it to anyone with money. The genius or insanity of Turbonique was that Middlebrooks identified a perfect legal loophole. In 1962, there were no federal regulations specifically prohibiting the sale of rocket engines to civilians. The government had never imagined anyone would be crazy enough to try it. State regulations were scattered and mostly focused on explosive storage, not propulsion systems. As long as he wasn't selling actual weapons and kept his fuel below certain explosive thresholds, Middlebrooks operated in a gray area that nobody had thought to make illegal yet. His first products were relatively tame, if you can call anything from Turbonique tame. The Turbonique supercharger wasn't really a supercharger at all. It was a turbine engine that force-fed air into your regular engine. Unlike a traditional turbocharger that used exhaust gases or a supercharger that ran off a belt, the Turbonique unit had its own combustion chamber. You filled a small tank with what Middlebrooks called thermaline, essentially monopropellant rocket fuel. Flip a switch, and the turbine would spin up to 50,000 RPM in about 1 second, cramming air into your engine at 5 psi of boost. The engineering was actually brilliant. The turbine housing was cast from Inconel, the same high-temperature alloy used in rocket nozzles. The shaft ran on special high-speed bearings rated for 100,000 RPM. The combustion chamber could handle temperatures over 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. This wasn't backyard engineering. It was legitimate aerospace technology. The problem was the fuel. Thermaline was Middlebrooks' proprietary name for N-propyl nitrate, a monopropellant that's basically one step away from being a bomb. It doesn't need oxygen to burn. It carries its own oxidizer. That's great for rockets. It's terrifying for something bolted to your engine. If the combustion became unstable, the whole unit could explode. But the supercharger was just the appetizer. The main course was the Turbonique rocket drag axle. This wasn't an add-on or modification. It was a complete rear axle assembly with an integrated rocket motor. You removed your car's entire rear end, differential, axles, everything, and bolted in this unit. The center section housed a rocket motor that produced 1,300 pounds of thrust. That translated to roughly 1,300 horsepower at the wheels. For comparison, the most powerful production car engine of 1965, the 426 Hemi, made 425 horsepower. This thing made 3 times that power, and it weighed only 100 pounds. The specifications were mind-bending. The rocket motor itself was beautifully simple, just a combustion chamber, an injection system, and a de Laval nozzle. No moving parts except the propellant valve. The thrust was transmitted directly to the axles through a special coupling that could handle the instantaneous torque. The whole system was self-contained. You filled the propellant tank with about 5 gallons of thermaline, enough for a 5-second burn. A high-pressure nitrogen bottle provided the feed pressure. An electric solenoid valve controlled by a simple toggle switch started and stopped the flow. That was it. Flip the switch, count to 5, pray you're still pointing straight. The rocket produced 1,300 pounds of thrust continuously throughout the burn. But here's where the physics got interesting. Thrust and horsepower aren't the same thing. Horsepower is thrust multiplied by velocity. As the car accelerated, the effective horsepower increased. At 60 Nm, that 1,300 pounds of thrust equaled about 650 horsepower. At 120 Nm, it was making 1,300 horsepower. At 180 Nm, which some cars actually achieved, it was producing nearly 2,000 horsepower. The faster you went, the more power you made. It was a positive feedback loop of acceleration that only ended when you ran out of fuel, ran out of track, or ran out of luck. The installation was supposedly straightforward. The axle came with detailed instructions, templates for cutting the fuel tank, mounting holes, and even suggestions for reinforcing your chassis. Because, yeah, your 1960s car wasn't designed to handle rocket thrust. Middlebrooks recommended adding steel plates to spread the load. He suggested upgrading your front brakes since the rears were now just along for the ride. He even included calculations for adjusting your suspension to handle the thrust vector. It was thorough, professional documentation for an absolutely insane product. The first public demonstration happened at Tampa Dragway in early 1963. Middlebrooks himself drove a 1963 Chevrolet station wagon equipped with a drag axle. The crowd expected a joke. What they got was a physics lesson. The wagon left the line with the front wheels 3 feet in the air, flames shooting from beneath the rear bumper. It covered the quarter mile in 9:36 seconds at 146 mph. For context, professional top-fuel dragsters of that era were running similar times. This was a station wagon, with the back seat still installed. Word spread through the racing community like wildfire. Here was a bolt-on product that could make any car competitive in drag racing. You didn't need years of engine-building experience. You didn't need to spend thousands on machine work. You just needed $4,995, about $47,000 in today's money, and a death wish. The catalog copy was remarkable. Middlebrooks wrote it himself, mixing technical specifications with carnival barker enthusiasm. "Leap ahead of competition with rocket power," one ad proclaimed. Another promised, "No warm-up needed, full power instantly. Leave them wondering what happened." The technical manual was more sobering, with sections titled Propellant Safety and Emergency Procedures that basically amounted to run away quickly. The customer base was eclectic. Professional drag racers looking for any edge. Rich thrill seekers who wanted the ultimate toy. And more than a few people who probably shouldn't have been allowed near anything more powerful than a lawnmower. Turbonique didn't discriminate. If your check cleared, they'd ship you a rocket. The most famous Turbonique customer was Captain Jack McClure, a legendary drag racer who campaigned a series of rocket-powered Volkswagens. His Jetbug was a study in contradictions, a cute little Beetle that could outrun Corvettes. McClure would roll up to drag strips, accept money races from unsuspecting marks, then destroy them with rocket power. He became a traveling carnival act, touring the country and demonstrating that, yes, you really could buy rocket engines through the mail. But McClure was a professional who understood the risks. Not everyone was so careful. The accident started almost immediately. A driver in Texas lost control when his rocket ignited unevenly, sending him sideways at 140 mph. He survived, but the car was scattered across a quarter mile of desert. A teenager in California triggered his rocket while still in the staging lanes, shooting across the return road and into the crowd. 3 people were hospitalized. The car was never found. Legend says it's still orbiting. The failure modes were spectacular and varied. Sometimes the propellant would detonate instead of burn, turning the entire rear axle into shrapnel. Sometimes the thrust coupling would fail, sending the rocket motor through the fuel tank. Sometimes the driver would simply run out of talent before running out of thrust. Every Turbonique accident was unique in its destructive creativity. The thermaline fuel itself was a nightmare. It was hypergolic with many common materials, meaning it would spontaneously ignite on contact. Spill some on your jeans? They might burst into flames. Get some on rubber? Instant fire. The storage requirements were strict. Stainless steel containers, away from heat, away from organics, away from pretty much everything. Middlebrooks sold it in 5-gallon safety cans for $30 per gallon. That's $280 per gallon in today's money, for something that could kill you if you looked at it wrong. But the drag axle was actually the conservative option. For the truly insane, Turbonique offered the Microjet series, complete jet engines small enough to strap to go-karts. The T-16 Microjet produced 240 pounds of thrust and weighed just 12 pounds. It was marketed for experimental aircraft, but everyone knew where they were really going. YouTube's predecessor was 8mm film of go-karts breaking 150 mph before inevitably becoming airborne. The engineering behind these mini-jets was legitimately impressive. The combustion chambers used film cooling, where a thin layer of uncombusted fuel protected the walls from the 2,000-degree flame front. The turbine wheels were investment cast from Hastelloy X, a superalloy developed for rocket engines. The fuel injection used tiny sapphire orifices that could meter propellant precisely at high pressure. This was space-age technology you could order from the back of Hot Rod magazine. Middlebrooks even offered a rocket go-kart kit, a complete chassis with an integrated rocket motor. The frame was chrome moly steel, professionally welded. The rocket produced 600 pounds of thrust. The total weight was 150 pounds. Do the math on that thrust-to-weight ratio. It was essentially a manned missile with wheels. The promotional photos showed children driving them. Children. By 1965, Turbonique was shipping dozens of units per month. The company had a proper factory, employees, even a test facility where they'd fire rockets all day long. Neighbors complained about the noise, the flames, the occasional explosion. Local fire marshals didn't know what to do with them. The FAA said rockets were fine as long as they stayed on the ground. The state of Florida was just happy to have an aerospace company creating jobs. The catalog expanded to include even more insane products. The Turbonique supercharger kit now came in multiple sizes. The DS-28 could provide 15 psi of boost, enough to blow head gaskets on most engines. The AP-2 was specifically designed for boats because apparently regular boats weren't dangerous enough. They even offered a rocket helicopter kit that was exactly what it sounds like. Strap rockets to your rotor tips for auxiliary power. The FAA finally paid attention to that one. The racing successes kept coming. Tommy Evo, one of drag racing's biggest stars, ran Turbonique rockets on his Videoliner dragster. He covered the quarter mile in 8:36 seconds at 181 mph. Doug Cookie Cook bolted a drag axle to a front-engine dragster and ran 790 at 198 mph, knocking on the door of 200 mph in 1965. These weren't back-alley racers. These were legitimate professionals setting records with mail-order rockets. But for every success, there were multiple disasters. A driver in Ohio had his thermaline tank rupture during a run. The propellant sprayed across the hot rocket nozzle and ignited. The resulting fireball was visible from 3 miles away. The driver survived by jumping out at 80 milliliters. He broke both legs but considered himself lucky. The car burned for 4 hours. The track surface had to be repaved. The insurance situation was exactly what you'd expect, non-existent. No company would cover Turbonique products. Tracks started banning them, then unbanning them when crowds demanded rocket runs, then banning them again after the next accident. It was a constant cycle of spectacular entertainment and equally spectacular lawsuits. Middlebrooks's response to safety concerns was basically, read the manual. He'd included warnings. He'd specified proper procedures. If people chose to ignore them, that wasn't his fault. This was the 1960s. Product liability law was still developing. The concept of inherently dangerous products hadn't been fully established. As far as Middlebrooks was concerned, he was selling engineering products to competent adults who understood the risks. The beginning of the end came in 1966. A spectacular accident at a Florida drag strip killed 2 spectators when a rocket car went airborne and landed in the stands. The investigation revealed the driver had overfilled his thermaline tank, causing an explosion instead of controlled burn. The families sued everyone, the driver, the track, and Turbonique. Middlebrooks won the lawsuit on a technicality, but the writing was on the wall. Then came the federal investigation. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms had finally noticed that thermaline met their definition of an explosive. Shipping it across state lines without proper permits was a federal crime. The Postal Service realized they'd been unknowingly transporting rocket fuel. The Department of Transportation wondered why rocket motors were traveling on public highways. Suddenly, everyone wanted to talk to Gene Middlebrooks. The raid came in March 1968. Federal agents surrounded the Turbonique facility at dawn. They found 500 gallons of thermaline, dozens of completed rocket motors, and enough components to build 100 more. They also found something else, evidence that Middlebrooks had been selling to foreign buyers, including some in countries that weren't exactly friendly to the United States. That moved it from dangerous business to national security concern. Middlebrooks was arrested on multiple federal charges: illegal transportation of explosives, operating without proper licenses, mail fraud for shipping hazardous materials without declaration. The trial was a sensation. The prosecution presented charred car parts and injury photos. The defense argued that Middlebrooks was an innovator being persecuted for pushing boundaries. The jury took 2 hours to convict on all counts. He was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison, but served 18 months. Turbonique's assets were seized and destroyed. The remaining inventory of rockets was taken to a military range and blown up, ironically, probably the safest thing that ever happened to them. The molds, tooling, and technical drawings were confiscated. Officially, they were destroyed. Unofficially, some of that technology allegedly found its way into classified military projects. When Middlebrooks got out of prison in 1970, the world had changed. Ralph Nader had published Unsafe at Any Speed. The Consumer Product Safety Commission existed. The EPA was regulating emissions. The idea of selling rockets through mail order was as dead as the muscle car era itself. Middlebrooks disappeared from public view, reportedly moving to Georgia, where he lived quietly until his death in 2005. But the legend of Turbonique lived on. Surviving units became holy grails for collectors. A complete drag axle sold at auction in 2018 for $125,000. The buyer was asked if he planned to run it. "Are you insane?" he replied. "I'm going to put it in a museum behind very thick glass." The technical legacy of Turbonique is more complicated than you might think. Some of Middlebrooks' innovations actually influenced legitimate aerospace development. His simplified propellant injection system was studied by NASA. His thrust coupling design showed up in classified military projects. The film cooling technique he used in the microjets became standard in certain rocket applications. Even in failure, Turbonique advanced rocket science. The cultural impact was enormous. Turbonique proved that Americans would buy absolutely anything if it promised more speed. It showed that the hot rod community's appetite for power was literally unlimited. It demonstrated that sometimes the difference between genius and insanity is just good lawyers, and it created some of the most spectacular footage in drag racing history. Modern engineers look at Turbonique products with a mixture of admiration and horror. The engineering was genuinely innovative. The manufacturing quality was excellent. The performance was undeniable. But the complete disregard for safety was breathtaking. One engineer who examined a surviving drag axle commented, "This is either the work of a genius or a madman, probably both." Today's regulatory environment makes Turbonique impossible to recreate legally. You'd need permits from the ATF, DOT, EPA, and probably Homeland Security. The liability insurance alone would cost millions. The idea of selling rocket engines to untrained civilians is so far outside modern safety culture that it seems like fiction. But for 6 glorious, terrifying years, it was real. There's something beautifully American about Turbonique. It could only have existed in that specific moment, after we'd developed rocket technology, but before we'd developed common sense about it. It required a culture that valued speed over safety, innovation over regulation, and spectacular failure over boring success. It needed customers crazy enough to strap rockets to their cars and a legal system that hadn't yet figured out why that was a bad idea. Gene Middlebrooks wasn't evil. He wasn't trying to kill people. He was an engineer who saw inefficiency in the world and tried to fix it. Everyone else was struggling to make cars go fast with pistons and gasoline. He had access to rocket technology. The solution seemed obvious to him. The fact that it was insanely dangerous was just an engineering problem to be solved with better documentation. In our modern world of five-star safety ratings and electronic nannies, there's something almost romantic about Turbonique. It represents a time when individuals could still do magnificently stupid things without committee approval, when innovation meant actual risk, not focus groups, when rapid unscheduled disassembly was just part of the development process. The truth is, Turbonique was simultaneously the worst and best idea in automotive history. Worst because it killed people, destroyed property, and gave teenagers access to military-grade propulsion. Best because it represented pure, unfiltered human ambition, the desire to go faster, consequences be damned, the belief that any problem could be solved with more thrust, the wonderful, terrible idea that maybe, just maybe, your daily driver needed a rocket. So here's to Gene Middlebrooks and Turbonique, to mail-order rockets and thermaline explosions, to Volkswagens running 9-second quarters and go-karts, breaking the speed of sound, to a time when the solution to every problem was more power and the only safety equipment was a fire extinguisher and a prayer. It was insane, it was dangerous, it was glorious, and thank God it's impossible to recreate today. What's the craziest modification you've ever seen someone do to their car? Drop a comment below and let me know if anything could possibly top mail-order rocket engines. If you enjoyed this deep dive into automotive insanity, hit that subscribe button for more stories of engineering gone wonderfully wrong. Until next time, keep your thrust vectors pointed in the right direction, and maybe be grateful that you can't order rocket motors from a catalog anymore.